Yeah. Anyway, I also write all sorts of other things. The thing with publishing is that it's all true that success breeds success. If you are successful in doing one thing, they'll say, well, maybe we'll buy one of your children's books or whatever. And children's books are very good because they are extremely stringent. Children are a very tough audience. They have bullshit detectors that are, come in at 700 watts. They're really, you cannot, not that I ever do, but you cannot pad the book, you cannot add anything extra. You've got to tell the story as clearly as you can and almost as flatly as you can. So they really know what they want. So I wrote the children's book that's been most successful is a depression story, which I swore I'd never write, called The Long Walk, which is about my own family, the four of us, setting out to get to Apollo Bay to find their father, and is very simple because it was actually written for. It's actually not a difficult thing if you want to write for a certain age. All you do is you just regress yourself to that age. If you want to write for a 12-year-old audience, you just go back to being 12. And one great advantage I had, which has nothing to do with any virtue, is that I just got allotted a very good memory. And because I spent a lot of my time as a child listening to people and remembering what they said, it got stretched. And we used to do, for instance, very old-fashioned things, like the process of cooking the dinner, feeding the people, washing the dishes, and, of course, mopping the kitchen floor, because my sister Amanda was the one who washed the dishes, and she was a sploshy watcher. Because she was so small, she had to stand in a chair. The first thing she bought when she had her house of her own was a dishwasher. But we used to, because we didn't have television for a long time, and we used to sing or recite. So I just learnt lots of poems and things by heart. And that does tend to exercise your memory. And it means also that it's almost an unknown skill now. So I can recite myself all the way through The Lady of Shalott, for instance, which, as you recall, begins, on either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the world and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And if you read it, if you're reciting aloud, you're in a different space. And also means that you get this very deep feeling for words because you're saying them out loud. It's not as though you're just reading them. So, for instance, I remember sonnets. My mistress eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more real than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hair be wires, black wires grow on her head. I love to hear her speak, and yet I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied by false compare. Which you can put next to, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and naughty. Rough winds to shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose complexion of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. As long as men shall live, and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. It's the same poet. He might even be talking about the same woman. It's just poetry is so attractive. And I am such a lousy poet. I really thought it'd be nice to be a poet, but I am very bad. I cannot write poetry, so I just have to write novels instead. Now, you've been an extremely nice audience, so I'll now tell you the story of the shoplifting dog once I have it. Picture the scene. This is Sunshine Magistrates Court in the day when it was a bit like... it was one room smaller than this. It had a dungeon at the back, which was like a school shelter shed with bars on. And I had to interview most of my clients in the street. And this is when I was quite a new duty solicitor, and I had a magistrate who was considered to be very nasty and sarcastic. His name was Mr. Patrick Street. I would never have thought of him as Patrick Street. But what I found out about Mr. Street was actually he was bored out of his mind. He just wanted to be amused. He was far too actually intelligent to be a magistrate, because a lot of things that magistrates have to do are mind-bogglingly tedious, which is sitting there being lied to by people like me and my clients. So the first time I met him, I was, as I said, very new. And he said, Miss Greenwood, I'll now hear a couple of hours argument on Section 56 of the Bail Act. And I thought, what do I do? One, I've never heard of Section 56 of the Bail Act. And do I lie or do I bluff? And I thought, I'll tell him the truth. What have I got to lose? Apart from several ears and my practising certificate. So I leaned over and said the prosecutor's shoulder and looked at the section. And I said, well, look, at that stage, your worship, you may well hear 2 hours of argument about Section 56, but it isn't going to be from me. What I know about Section 56, I just read over the prosecutor's shoulder and he laughed. So I thought, all right, we've got a basis for negotiation here. Anyway, I had, for a duty solicitor, I had an utterly innocent client. Picture the scene. This is Mrs. I will call her Smith, 80 years old, blind, totally blind, widow. Her current guide dog is an amazingly beautiful black Labrador dog called Toby, aged 4, who sits there with little halos around his ears. You know how good dogs can be? I'm a good dog, he radiates from every pore, you know. And anyway, so and she was charged with shoplifting by an agent, which is usually where people let their children loose to eat the supermarket, you know. I thought that's strange. So what had happened apparently is every morning she used to let Toby out, and he would trot out, and she thought he was trotting down to the Salvation Army depot, which is just down the road, and getting his breakfast. But what he was doing was trotting into the IGA supermarket, going through, walking to the PAL dog food wherever the staff had hidden it, picking up his big tin of PAL and walking out without paying. Now, the IGA people thought he was very funny, and they kept on doing things like hiding the PAL so that he had to climb up to get it or whatever. The only time he got really cross was when they put it on a high shelf and he couldn't reach. He just sat there and barked. So he could find the PAL even when they'd taken the label off. So they thought it was funny. But then the supermarket had changed hands and had been bought by Safeway, who have no sense of humour. And they'd actually hired a private detective to follow Toby home and find out where he was taking his ill-gotten gains. And poor Mrs. Smith had no idea that Toby was stealing. And in fact, I wanted to plead not guilty and get the whole case thrown out, but I couldn't do it on that day, and she was so distressed at the idea of, after a totally blameless life, finding herself charged with a crime, that I thought, all right, very well, okay, we'll just, but I'm going to have fun with it. I said, okay, you just sit there and don't worry about what I say. So I sent my clerk back to Legal Aid, find every book relating to the law on animals. And there's an awful lot of it, most of it's Norman French. There is, for instance, the sow that was hanged for eating her children. There is the old manorial in Paris in 1350. There's an old manorial right of Harriet where the animal that kills someone is forfeit to the lord of the manor, and so on. And of course there were the leopard men in England in the 1920s. There were people who they thought they were animals. There was a collection of Victorian burglars who used a monkey to open upstairs windows, and so on. So I had a whole bunch of stuff. So I piled it all up so I could just see over the top. The police prosecutor's heart was not in this, by the way. So I sort of warned him, I'm going to make a meal out of this. And he said, go ahead, Kerry, I'll just slip under the bar table and you won't notice me not being there, will you? So I started, because I knew that the representative of Safeways was sitting in the court, and I wanted him really embarrassed. And I wanted my client vindicated. Poor darling, it was not her fault that she had a thieving dog. And who could say that he was old enough? I said, he's only 4, he's not old enough to form an intention. So we went through, I started off by challenging the magistrate to excuse himself because he wasn't a bishop. Because under the old Norman law thing, you had to have a benefit of clergy. And he said he was a bishop, but he'd left his hat at home. And I thought, we're proceeding along that basis. I started witted on that. And I went through 4 or 5 cases, and meanwhile the prosecutor was indeed, who is a nice boy called Rowan, gradually slipping underneath. And Mrs. Smith was totally bemused by the whole thing. And Toby's just sitting next to her, being a good dog. And so finally the magistrate cracked and started giggling. And he said, very well, Miss Greenwood, I'll dismiss the matter if I can reprove your client. And I said, well, look, I think she's a bit antique from, a serious reproof. And he said, that's the deal. I said, oh, no, it's your worship, please. And sat down. And so he stood up and said, you're a bad, bad